The Witcher, new Netflix series starring Henry Cavill, is out now, based on the book series written by Andrzej Sapkowski. And I was really nervous about it coming up to the series because I'm a huge fan of the books and the video games. It's probably my favorite fantasy series of all time. I hold it in higher regard than even Lord of the Rings and Song of Ice and Fire. And I was worried that the series would not live up to my love of the source material. Fortunately, it's better than I thought it would be, although I do have a number of criticisms about it, and I'm far from being completely enamored by the series, as a lot of people seem to be from the reactions I've seen and heard. So, if you know nothing about The Witcher, the original book series spans 7 tomes. The first two are short story collections, which set up the Slavic fantasy world and the character of Geralt of Rivia. He's the titular Witcher, which is a mutant, an artificially created monster hunter. He and the likes of his traverse the world and take on contracts for killing monsters. Now, the short stories mostly focus on that, each one detailing one of Geralt's adventures across the years, while also slowly building up and setting up the overarching plot of the saga that follows in the next 5 tomes. And while initially Geralt is the sole main protagonist, eventually, as we progress into the saga, he begins to share the spotlight with Ciri, a princess from a ravaged country that is bound to Geralt by destiny, but also due to her heritage and genetics plays a huge role in the grander scheme of things. The first season of the series is mostly adapting the first 2 books, so the short stories. But right from the get-go, it divides the runtime almost equally between Geralt, Ciri, and Yennefer, the sorceress femme fatale who is Geralt's on and off romantic interest. After the trailers revealed that we would, in essence, have this trifecta, I was a bit worried that the series would stray far from the source material in order to go to the events of Saga straight away to try to set them up very quickly. But I'm happy to say that for the most part that's not the case. The books are adapted fairly accurately with not too many changes. I think the biggest one is the amount of focus that Yennefer gets, and honestly, it isn't something that I liked. In the series, we get to see her entire backstory of becoming a sorceress and living through decades. In the books, by comparison, we had none of that. We met her as an established, developed character with only, I think, one line spoken about her past. And that made her really interesting. That it gave her this air of mystique. She was a character full of flame and confidence, to the point of arrogance, actually. And she took shit from nobody. And the series makes it a point to show that she wasn't always like that, to show how she got there. And in my opinion, that removes some of that air of cool around her. Other than that, there are several smaller changes made to the story in comparison to the books. And here's an interesting thing, okay? I expected that some things would have to be omitted or changed, mainly for budget reasons. It's the first season after all. Netflix probably wouldn't want to blow all their money on CGI when they don't know what the reception is going to be. But what ended up not being the case, really. Most of the smaller changes do not impact the scale and the budget of the spectacle. In fact, they're quite the opposite. They mostly replace one scene of dialogue with another scene of dialogue, changing just the mechanics of the story or the sequence of events. And pretty much every time the result is worse than in the source material, and there seems to be little to no reason why you'd have to do that in the first place. An example is the episode about the djinn. Without spoiling too much, in the books, the first wish that was used was a really inventive plot device, a plot point, and also simultaneously one of the funniest moments of the entire book once it was revealed what it actually was. And here it is changed to a different wish that is essentially just a throwaway line. And I was wondering, why would you do this, especially as this ties into the whole bigger thing, which is humor. The books were full of it. There were loads of jokes and funny situations, and I think that the series loses a lot of that. There are individual moments sometimes, but for the most part, the series treats itself super seriously and comes off stiff, to be honest. It comes down to dialogue mostly. Dialogue which, in my opinion, was the best part of the original books. Sapkowski has a true knack for writing in such a way that he's able to bring gravity to the lines, but also isn't afraid to tone the pathos down with humor. To have the characters themselves point out and ridicule stuff that deserves to be ridiculed, which is often the fantasy genre tropes, like, all this talk about destiny. Reading those books, you always could imagine there were real people saying those things, and in the series, unfortunately, often not so much. And that's, again, in principle, the same general complaint. Just trust the source material. Adapt the dialogue one to one if you have to. In most cases, it should work. There's There's a reason people love those books, and the more you change, the worse it's going to be, quite simply, especially if you drop the natural charm and humor and instead try to be dark and edgy and serious all the time. In terms of casting, there were a lot of controversies in regards to that before the series was even released. A lot of the people were upset about the forced diversity in a heavily Slavic inspired story. And to an extent, I agree with those concerns. I think inserting people of color into random roles just for the sake of having them in The Witcher, to me, is equivalent of making Black Panther with half the people being white for the sake of diversity for no reason at all. Because the setting of the story was a Slavic, white dominated continent. It was said outright in the books multiple times that there are stories of other lands elsewhere where people with different colored skin live. And before you go all social justice warrior on me, you should know that racism and the critique of racism was a huge theme of the books. But Sapkowski used elves and dwarves and other non-human races as his fantasy equivalents, as his conduits to black people and people from Asia or Middle East. In fact, there was a huge factor that was a huge factor that made the books different from most of the other fantasy stuff. It wasn't all rainbows and unicorns and harmony. And for example, elves were on the one hand very heavily discriminated against. On the other, they were far from perfect and lovely themselves. So there was a lot of that social commentary in the books, which I think is missed in the series. The series does try to touch on that a little bit, but pretty much just in one episode, and it does so in a very heavy-handed and unsubtle way. It just completely skirts the surface and loses the subtlety of the books, of the source material. And by the way, if you haven't done so already, just do pick up the books because they are seriously terrific. Never mind all that though, back to the casting. As much as I wanted The Witcher to remain as Slavic as possible, I actually ended up having no problems with the diversity of the cast, but I did have problems with some of the people being hit and miss purely in terms of acting. My biggest gripe is probably Triss Merigold, who is bland as a cardboard box and has none of the charm of the original character. And it's also baffling to me because as far as I remember, she is either not introduced at all in the first two tomes, or she just has a very tiny role. And here it's like the creators trying to insert her earlier on so that we know who the character is later when she pops up. But she plays a very small role here, and she doesn't play it well, let's put it this way. I also found Yennefer to be a bit lacking. I always envisioned her as more of a hard bitch, let's be frank, and I think the actress here does not fully channel that strength, that edge. She comes off as a bit whiny at times. Henry Cavill as Geralt himself is good. I wouldn't mind more levity and humor from him, but I suppose that's more of a direction and writing problem than himself. He's certainly terrific in purely physical terms. He worked out for the role and actually learned swordplay. He insisted on not using stunt doubles and to perform the action scenes himself. And the work he put in really shows, because those action scenes, and he in them, are one of the best parts of the show. Ciri is really good. Queen Calanthe is fantastic. My favorite episode is probably the one with the dragon. Both Borch and the dwarves that show up just completely steal the show. And the episode also has Jaskier, who I also liked a lot. Finally, in terms of technical aspects, I'm kind of on the fence. Some things were really good and others not so much. The monster design and CGI, surprisingly enough, really good. The action sequences, the music, all fantastic. No complaints here. Same for set design, same for locations. Costume design and props, I think that was hit and miss. Geralt looks fine for the most part, so do the mages, but on the other hand, we have stuff like the terrible Nilfgaardian armor, which really made me scratch my head. It looks absolutely shit. Good news is that the costume designer has already been confirmed to change for the second season, so we can expect improvements. The cinematography I thought was clunky. A lot of the scenes feel stiff and lifeless, and not just because of the dialogue, but also because you'll, for example, have three characters stand in a room like planks and just talk without any movement, without any animation. Combine that with often weird camera angles and placement, and it just made me think of uninspired daytime TV drama. It's just boring and uninteresting. And also, this is going to sound like a bizarre and very specific complaint, but the way the sets are lit. Very often you'll have a scene where either in a forest or in a town or in a building, and there will be that one strong source of light right outside of the scene, from behind the trees or from the window, which is made to look like the sun shining, but it's just really visible that this is a huge ass lamp. And it makes it clear that those people are actually all actors standing on a set. I know maybe if you don't pay so much attention to the technicalities, you won't notice that, but I tend to do look out for that stuff, and so it took me out of the scene a lot of the times. In any case, overall from me, the first season is a 6 out of 10, honestly. It's perfectly decent, but it hasn't yet wowed me in any significant way. I know I had a lot of problems with it, I was very critical about it, but if you think about it, honestly, it's not like any of those things, in my opinion, was totally botched and ruined. I think most of the issues can be corrected, and most of them quite easily, actually. And as we already know, the second season is coming. I'm quite positive. I'm hoping that the creators will listen to the constructive criticism and will improve the areas that can be improved, because there certainly is a lot of room to do so. We'll have to wait and hope for the best. And in the meantime, season 1 is still definitely worth watching, especially if you're a fantasy fan.